Okay, let's look at one very important and common ratio. It's called the DuPont ratio, or the DuPont Identity. The DuPont Identity was popularized or founded by the DuPont Corporation. It's a more sophisticated method of value or return because it breaks return on equity into three different pieces. It illustrates the interaction between profit, assets, and leverage. So we use operating efficiency, asset use efficiency, and financial leverage to determine how well a company is doing. So for example, if a company used a lot of financial leverage, if they were using, say, a tremendous amount of financial leverage like the banks were a while ago, you could see that the banks weren't making much profit. The operating profit was slow, their operating efficiency was low, but the leverage was huge, so they were making good profits. And you think about that, well, that's very risky. They've got a lot of leverage there. So when you think of breaking it into pieces, there's a reason you would do this, to see where they're making their profits. Where are the profits coming from? Are they really efficient in their operations, or are they have huge margins in their profit and their profit products? Or are they just using it through financial leverage? And so breaking it apart will be helpful. Let's look at how to break it apart. The derivation of the DuPont identity, we don't do too many of these in this class, but this one's important. So we have return on equity. We know that's net income divided by total equity. We multiply by 1, which is total assets divided by total assets, which is multiplying by 1. And we find that we can find net income divided by total assets times total assets divided by total equity equals the return on assets, net income over total assets, times the equity multiplier, which is total assets over total equity. So you can see by a little bit of adding a number in there, another variable in there, we can find out some additional information. And then we do it again. We multiply by 1 again, in this case sales divided by sales, and we squeeze sales in there. So net income over sales equals profit margin. Sales over total assets equal your total assets turnover. And of course, total assets divided by total equity equals your equity multiplier. And so we have our profitability and our productivity and our financial leverage ratios all in one equation, which turns out the number of return on equity. So let's look at an example. The example here is return on assets is 10.12 and the equity multiplier is 1.39. So the return on equity is 10.12 times 1.39, or about a little over 14%. So we've got our return on equity number, and we've got our return on assets and our equity multiplier. We add in the profit margin and the total assets turnover, and we can find out the return on equity is 15.7 profit margin times total average asset turnover of 0.64, and we have a equity multiplier of 1.39 for a return on equity of around 14%. So we can see that it's broken apart into three different facets. In this case, profit margin 15.7 sounds pretty good. Total asset turns would be indicative of a business that has a lot of capital in it that is not turning that capital very quickly. Clearly, a firm that has very little capital in it, no assets and excessive assets, would be turning it much faster than this. And then, of course, the equity multiplier means that the firm is either leveraged or not. And this equity multiplier of 1.39 says that there is some leverage there, but not a tremendous amount of leverage there. It's certainly not levered up 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 5 to 1. So it's probably a highly capitalized company. There's a lot of money in capital equipment, and it's not turning over very fast, but also that they aren't using a lot of financial leverage. They've brought a lot of cash into the company to buy equity. So that's one quick analysis. If you want to look at ROE, this is the profit margin, total assets turned, and equity multiplier. Just as a overview, profit margin is the firm's measure of operating efficiency. In other words, how well it controls costs. So we're making profit. The second one is the asset turns. This is a measure of its productivity, how well it manages its assets. We don't have additional assets that don't do anything. We've gotten rid of all those, or we don't have any of those. In addition to that, we have the equity multiplier, which is its financial leverage. And we know that financial leverage can be very, very high in some cases, obviously in banks and so on. But we know that financial leverage, more importantly, is directly related to risk. And if something were to go wrong in a very highly leveraged firm, it doesn't take long for that firm to get into trouble. So in the determinants of growth, if you want to look at the analysis this way, the profit margin is your operating efficiency, the asset turns is your asset use efficiency, or your productive use of those assets. Financial leverage is your optimal debt ratio, or the debt ratio which you've decided to run the company. And of course, there's the other thing is how much cash do the shareholders get to keep, and how much cash do you reinvest in the firm. So by looking at this one ratio, the DuPont ratio, breaking into three pieces, you have the little dividend policy at the end to be thinking about that as well. You can see how the growth of the company is going to grow, or how the company is going to grow. It needs to grow profit margins, it needs to grow asset turns, it needs to grow through smart financial debt ratio leverage. It needs leverage, but it needs smart leverage so it's not at risk. And of course, how much money does the company keep, and how much money does the company give back to shareholders is another determinant of growth. So the DuPont ratio tells us quite a bit about a company, and breaking it into these three pieces tells us much more than just a simple a ROE, return on equity. Net income over total equity is not as complete as this analysis, which is why a lot of people like the DuPont analysis as a measure of the firm. It tells you quite a bit about it.